Can we put on our face masks? And also ensure that we adhere to the NCDC guidelines. So we have enough seats around you, so you can actually just maybe give a space and then sit on another seat. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you to today's Corruption Perception Index launch. My name is Samuel Asimi, and I run errands for CISLAC. CISLAC is the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. CISLAC is also the national chapter of Transparency International in Nigeria. We welcome you to this launch, and we will kick off the event right away. So just before we have the press conference, we will take you through the methodology of the Corruption Perception Index, that's the CPI. So as we all know, the CPI is the Corruption Perception Index, is computed by Transparency International, and it's published annually. Can we all be seated and so we comment? So I would like to request that you just focus on the projector here. So the Corruption Perception Index, CPI, it's developed by Transparency International since 1995. It's an annual ranking of countries on the prevalence of corruption within each country based on surveys by experts and business executives. The CPI is computed by Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin, Germany, and CISLAC as the chapter of Transparency International will launch this here in Nigeria. The CPI aggregates data from a number of different sources that provide perception by business people and country experts on the level of corruption in the public sector. It's important to stress that it measures administrative and political corruption, not citizens' perception of corruption. I think for this, you could get it from the Corruption Barometer prepared by which is a survey conducted by Afrobarometer and Transparency International. And you can also check the UNODC and the National Bureau of Statistics Corruption Survey in Nigeria to actually get the perception. But the CPI measures administrative and political corruption. The CPI is a composite data index that makes use of different sources. For the 2020 CPI, 8 sources were used to calculate the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index in Nigeria for 2020. The CPI produces 2 numbers, a score from 0 to 100 and a rank. The rank is the position where a country is situated in the table, of course, compared to other countries. The score uses a scale of 0 to 100. Where 0. The score uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is very clean. Because of an update in the methodology, the CPI scores before 2012 are not comparable with the ones after 2012 because the methodology changed. So this is important for our friends in the media, because if you want to compare it over time, you could compare from 2012 up until 2020, but not before because the methodology changed. Thank you. As you note this. So the CPI sources for Nigeria, we have the Bertelsmann Foundation Transformation Index. We have the Economist Intelligence Unit's country ratings. We have the Global Insight Country Risk Ratings. We have the Political Risk Services International Country Risk Guide. We have the Varieties of Democracy Project. We have the World Bank Country Policy and Institutional Assessment. We have the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey. And we have the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. So these are the CPI sources for Nigeria in 2020. So the CPI captures manifestation of corruption. Manifestations of corruption. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. You know, Nigerians, we are good at improvising, so I'll just be a patriotic Nigerian now, and I'll also improvise. So the manifestation of corruption captured by the CPI, we look at bribery. So the CPI captures bribery. It captures diversion of public funds. It captures the prevalence of officials using public office for private gain without facing the consequences. It captures the ability of governments to contain corruption and enforce effective integrity mechanisms in the public sector. It also looked at red tape and excessive bureaucratic burden, which may increase opportunities of corruption. It also looked around nepotism in appointments in civil service. It looks around the criminal prosecution for corrupt officials, how effective they are. It looks around adequate laws on financial disclosure and conflict of interest. It looked at state capture by narrow and vested interests. It also looks at access of civil society to information on public affairs. Manifestation of corruption not captured by the CPI. So it doesn't capture citizens' perception or experience of corruption. It doesn't capture tax fraud. It doesn't capture illicit financial flows. It doesn't capture enablers of corruption like lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, and the rest. It doesn't capture money laundering. It doesn't capture private sector corruption. And as well, and the informal economies market. Calculation of the CPI. So the CPI is calculated using each data source from these 8 sources I just mentioned. So before the source is used, CPI ensures that the CPI must, of course, quantify perception of corruption in the public sector. It must be based on a reliable and valid methodology with scores and ranks of multiple countries around the same scale. It must be performed by a credible institution. It should allow for sufficient variation of scores to distinguish between countries. It should also give ratings to a substantial number of countries. And the ratings must be given by country experts or business persons. The The institution conducting this, of course, must repeat their assessment at least every 2 years. So in calculating the CPI, the scores are standardized from different sources. So all those 8 sources mentioned, they have different scores. From some measure from 0 to 100, others maybe 1 to 10, and the rest. So CI standardizes these scores to ensure that it's in a standard form and can also be graded with other sources, after which the average is calculated. And if you look at the slide, we have the CPI score for Nigeria. We've compared it, the 2019 score and the 2020 score, and the change. So we could see in 2020, Nigeria scored 25, and you could see the rank as well. You could see the sources, same as that of 2019. Then this graph tries to provide a trend on Nigerian score on the CPI in the past 9 years, from 2012 up until 2020. Thank you very much for this. I don't know if you have any questions, or do you want to wait after the statement? You ask a question after the press conference. I think that would be a nice idea. So we'll just go straight into the press. So join me as I welcome to read the statement. We have Malam Awal Ibrahim Musa Rafsanjani. We have Mr. Austin Aigbe from CDD. Malam Awal Ibrahim Musa Rafsanjani is the Executive Director of CISLAC and the Head of Transparency International in Nigeria. We have Mr. Austin Aigbe, who represents the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD. We have Mr. Salahuddin Hashim, who represents CISLAC. We have Ms. Batche Batagwai, who represents CISLAC. And we have Mr. Tolutope Agoleni, who represents Budget. But first, we'll start with Malam Awal Ibrahim Musa Rafsanjani. He will be giving us reading the first statement of this press. Okay.
The 2020 Corruption Perception Index, CPI, released globally by Transparency International, TI, today shows that Nigeria yet again records a decline in the CPI in 2020. Published exclusively in Nigeria by the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC, the National Chapter of Transparency International, the index reveals that Nigeria scored 25 out of 100 points in the 2020 CPI, peeling back by 1 point compared to last year. In the country comparison for this year, Nigeria ranks 149 out of 183 countries, 3 places down compared to 2019 results. The Corruption Perception Index aggregates data from 8 different sources that provide perception by Nigerians' business community and country experts on the level of corruption in the public sector. While the index does not show specific incidences of corruption, it is an indication of the perception of the Nigerian public about the state of corruption in Nigeria. The index is completely impartial, objective, and globally well respected. This result is coming at the heels of the numerous challenges facing the country, ranging from the COVID-19 pandemic, insecurity, higher unemployment, and the sharp increase in government borrowing, among others. While releasing its report on rising to the challenge, Nigeria's public response in December 2020, the World Bank warned that in the next 3 years, an average Nigerian would see a reversal of decades of economic growth and country could enter its deepest recession since 1980. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an independent think tank, Nigeria witnessed a total of 2,860 kidnappings in 2020, which was up from 1,386 in 2019. The picture is further gloomy when taking into consideration the unemployment data for the second quarter of the 2020 released by the National Bureau of Statistics. This survey by the NBS, which is the government's statistical agency, showed that 1 in 2 Nigerians is either unemployed, 27.1%, or underemployed, 28.6%. Each of these challenges can be linked to corruption and mismanagement of public resources, which further exacerbates the economic and health impact of the terrible global pandemic. Nigeria Corruption Perception Index score is just another reminder of the need for a fast, transparent, and robust response to the challenges posed by corruption to Nigeria. It is worrying that despite the numerous efforts by the state actors on the war against corruption, Nigeria is still perceived by students and members of the international community as being corrupt. CISLAC Transparency International is forced to ask why results did not commiserate with the efforts. So despite the fact that CISLAC and the Nigerian partners did not collect the CPI data as it is done by independent, reputable organizations, we and other well-meaning citizens have experienced pushback from various governments and their supporters when the CPI results and other indices turn unfavorable. Some of these pushback include leveling costs and patriotic citizens. In some instances, physical attacks were experienced. Therefore, going forward, we use this medium to call on the government and her supporters to examine the drivers behind Nigeria's deteriorating anti-corruption image and consider action which will tackle systematic corruption. We guarantee that the perception will improve in short term as law-abiding citizens, CISLAC, Transparency International, and other partners organizations in Nigeria are willing to work with the state and non-state actors on how to collectively improve Nigeria's fight against corruption as we have always done in the past.
It is important to stress that the ED is away, he's on quarantine, so he's adhering strictly to the NCDC guidelines because he just returned from an international trip. They will be reachable and available for interviews virtually, so you can actually contact them. So up next, we'll have our colleagues and partners from budget, Mr. Tolutope Agbondoye, to continue with the statement and to go on. You can come to it.
And let me change the seat, please. So, in case of no, change the seat. You can come here. So,
Okay, so I'm going to pick it up from where the ED stopped. CISLAC, Transparency International, and partners suspect a list of key weaknesses to explain why Nigeria may not have improved in the fight against corruption. Although there are various extent of below-mentioned factors on the unfavorable ranking this year. We feel that these areas require immediate improvement for the sake of the well-being of ordinary Nigerians. Weakness 1, absence of transparency in the COVID-19 pandemic response. With the COVID-19 pandemic out of Nigeria's responsibility, there has been a lack of transparency in the emergency response of the government. Coupled with the gap in coordination, the process has been fraught by incessant flouting of procurement guidelines, hoarding of relief materials and diversion of these materials, which are then used as personal souvenirs presented to the political party loyalists and close associates. We find it disturbing that in some cases, supplies donated by a group of well-meaning Nigerian business persons, corporate entities, development partners, and others under the coalition against COVID-19, were left inexplicably undistributed and in some cases rotten by the federal and state governments. While these occurrences are not specific to Nigeria, citizens are yet to see concrete action by the anti-graft agencies on these issues. Weakness 2, nepotism in the public service appointments and promotions. In the past year, we noticed nepotism and favoritism in the appointment and promotion of some public officers. For example, all Nigerians remember the controversy which trailed the decision of the Nigerian Judicial Council, NJC, when at least 8 of the 33 judges recommended for appointment by the NJC were either children or relatives of current or retired justices of the Supreme or Appeal Courts. The Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in itself is not an exception, with allegations of individuals promoted on the basis of their relationship and their affiliations as against merits and other criteria stated in the rule books. Reports around the commercialization of employment into various institutions, including admission into various tertiary educational institutions, puts the nation in bad light. The extortion for the acquisition of services like healthcare, passport renewals, and obtaining of visas creates a negative perception of Nigerian corruption. Sorry, let me take that again. The extortion for the acquisition of services like healthcare, passports renewal, and obtaining of visas creates a negative perception of corruption in Nigeria.
Weakness 3. Lack of adequate anti-corruption legal frameworks and interference by politicians in the operation of law enforcement agencies. CISLAC, Transparency International, is not oblivious of some successes recorded by the Nigerian government, such as the transparency portal managed and implemented by the Office of the Auditor General. These activities have the potential to bring corruption and wastefulness of the government agencies at all levels to the end. We fully support this initiative. Important anti-corruption legislation such as the Companies and Allied Matters Act, CAMA 2020, and the Police Act 2020 undeniably signal a move in the right direction. However, more needs to be done to enact legislation and implement it. The repeated failure to enact the Proceeds of Crime Act as a legal framework for the management and utilization of recovered assets in Nigeria, which is one of the key pillars of this administration's anti-corruption strategy, is inexplicable. So if we recall, this bill was passed in 2019, but assent wasn't granted. However, in October 2020, the President transmitted the Proceeds of Crime Bill to the National Assembly to be passed. So we hope that eventually this bill will be passed, because contained in this bill are provisions, comprehensive provisions that provide for seizure, confiscation, management of assets and proceeds of crime. When this bill is passed, we will have comprehensive provisions that give a proper guide on how assets recovered, can be judiciously used, for the betterment of the citizens of Nigeria. As at now, it is unclear. Yes, we hear that assets have been recovered and all that, but it's very unclear as to what these assets are being used for, how they are being used for, which institution in particular is responsible for the management of these assets, and even the records of what assets in particular have been recovered. So we hope that this bill will be enacted as soon as possible, so that some of these unclear issues can be clarified and Nigerians would begin to benefit from this process of crime. Okay, there is still a lack of accountability in some quarters of government, especially in terms of beneficial owners of lucrative government contracts. Out of millions of corrupt transactions experienced annually, only a few hundreds of offenders are investigated, let alone convicted on corruption charges. The current scenario where different institutions like the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, ICPC, Code of Conduct Bureau, National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, the Nigerian Police, and other agencies overlap with mandates and lack synergy is not sustainable and have proven to be a leeway to corruption. The infighting and politicizing of the anti-corruption agenda may be evident by the way of suspending the acting chairman of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, Mr. Ibrahim Mago. The accusation that he failed to give a proper account of assets recovered by his agency is questionable, provided no clear legal and policy asset recovery framework exists. CISLAC would like to point out that the theatric handling of the suspension of Mr. Mago could have been done better, and this greatly contributes to the negative image of Nigeria's anti-corruption campaign. The absence of a whistleblower protection legislation leaves Nigeria anti-corruption agencies deprived of key insider intelligence, without which an anti-corruption crusade is made impossible. I'd like to speak briefly on this as well. So we know that in 2016, a whistleblower policy was introduced, and it is being financed by the Federal Ministry of Finance. And in the first 3 months, where this after this policy was introduced, there were thousands of people, that reached out to the Ministry of Finance, to report incidences of corruption, because the policy provided for anonymous complaints and anonymous reports. Years later, we see security agencies like the Nigerian police also adopting something similar to their complete response units that provide citizens also the opportunity to report instances of police misconduct to the Nigerian police so that those officers can be punished. And these reports can be made through their various platforms, through social media handles, through phone calls, and they can be done anonymously. And we have seen Nigerians also making this complaint. This goes to show that this is a very positive initiative that will definitely help in promoting our anti-corruption campaign in Nigeria. However, a legislation needs to be put in place because there's still this fear and lack of trust, among citizens. And what is the fear? Will I be protected? Will my identity, be protected? What will I suffer backlash for reporting, the corruption that I've witnessed or I've been a victim of? And there are so many people who have been stigmatized. There are so many people who have been laid off work. There are so many people who have suffered one form of backlash or the other for speaking out against instances of corruption. But when we have the legislation in place, it will provide for some form of protection for whistleblowers, and it will build confidence in citizens, to adequately, come out and report these instances of corrupt practices. Also, the legislation will also provide clear punishment for people who just come out to report because of vindictive reasons and vindictive purposes. We also see this legislation will also help to provide clear punishment, clear punishment for people who are found wanting, people who are found guilty of committing this corrupt practice. So it is very important to have the legislation in place because it has that legal binding. This is just a policy. A policy doesn't have that kind of legal binding that the whistleblower has. So if we have the Whistleblower Act, that will go a long way in helping fight against corruption. Thank you.
We're taking it from weakness number 4, prevalence of bribery and extortion in the Nigerian police force. The year 2020 witnessed the EndSARS protest, which saw young people across the nation demanding an end to police brutality and corruption. A factor that led to this protest was widespread bribery and extortion by law enforcement officials, especially the police. The first and second national corruption survey conducted by United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, in partnership with the government's National Bureau of Statistics, NBC, and released in 2017 and 2019, both show that Nigerian police is the institution with the highest prevalence of bribery among the institutions measured. While there has been commendable effort by the Nigerian Police Complaint Response Unit, CRU, in reducing police abuses, there is need to scale up the effort of the unit to meet the demand of citizens as contained in the Police Act 2020. Weakness number 5, security sector corruption. From violent extremism and insurgency to piracy, kidnapping for ransom, attack on oil infrastructure, drug trafficking, and organized crime, Nigeria faces a host of complex security challenges. These threats typically involve irregular forces and other largely societally based. They are most prevalent and persistent in marginalized areas where communities feel high levels of distrust towards the government. And they also built up over many years. And their roles. These security challenges are symptoms of larger failure in governance. As many of Nigerian security threats are domestic in nature, the Nigerian police force is often a primary security interface with the public. However, low level of public trust in the police inhibit the cooperation needed to be effective against these societally based threats. Nigeria's security system is also perceived to be politicized. Leaders are often appointed based on their political allegiances rather than on their experience or capacity in law enforcement. As a result, the quality of leadership at the end of affair suffers. Appointees under such circumstances feel loyalty to their political patron rather than to the institution or citizens. How and to whom the law is applied is not consistent. Norms of professionalism and ethics are weakened. The problem of non-meritocracy in leadership is exhibited by a command and control structure that is obeyed, centralized and often chaotic. Security leaders who have not earned their position lose the respect of their colleagues, who are then more likely to abandon a unit when facing an armed threat. Insufficient understanding or commitment to effectiveness among force leadership often result in the neglect of training. Problems of police engagement with community are thus perpetrated. The continuous opaqueness in the utilization of security for votes contributes to the corruption perception in the country. And this process must be reformed, especially when we have security agencies living and working in very poor conditions. Multiple reports of police officers protesting non-payment of allowances for election duty are now seen. The result of this is widespread kidnappings, banditry, and terrorism ravaging different parts of the country.
All right, so just so that we don't run the risk of providing a diagnosis and not prescribing solutions. So we have therefore decided to provide a number of recommendations that would also help governments in solving some of those weaknesses that we have itemized. And of course, the first one for us would be that government needs to, as a matter of urgency, institute a framework that deals with transparency in the utilization of COVID-19 relief fund by state and non-state actors. This must be ensured as a measure and mechanism to rebuild confidence between citizens and the state, because part of what resulted in the anger of the youth and of course ended up as the revolution that we saw in the outgone year is a function of the angst against the state. So citizens have lost confidence, and government must demonstrate a deliberate effort to be able to rebuild that particular confidence. And of course, in doing that, every anti-graft agencies must follow up cases of corruption in the COVID-19 response process and reports that were also issued from the Office of the Auditor General. And I will include here that report also includes the report of the ICPC that also reported huge amounts of money that was recovered from an individual's account. And that was a fallout of the school feeding program when everywhere was actually locked down. And that money ran into millions, and of course in cash and of course in property. And that in itself is something that requires an immediate interrogation. Public servants should be appointed, appraised, and promoted on merit to produce or to reduce the level of nepotism and favoritism. Low-sidedness in appointment increases perception of corruption of the due process. And this is a fundamental challenge that has continued to deepen the divide in this country. That particular divide has actually, as a matter of fact, reduced the level of patriotism amongst citizens, because people now believe that for some purposes, they have been ostracized from the system, and that in itself sends a very wrong signal to the entire part of the country. The National Assembly should speed up the deliberation and passage of relevant anti-corruption related laws or amendments to strengthen anti-corruption efforts in the interest of Nigerians. The presidency should assent to these laws once they are passed, while taking into consideration the best interest of citizens. The government should commit to police reform by ensuring the full implementation of the Police Act 2020, support the ongoing judicial panel of inquiries, and prioritize the welfare of personnel of the Nigerian police. And of course, for me, this is actually cross-cutting. Not just Nigerian police, but every security personnel in this country should be, their welfare should be prioritized. Every personnel, particularly those in the front, should actually get some level of combat allowance. And this allowance should actually separate the need of those guys in the front and those who are not in the front line of conflict. Because we have seen cases of mass exodus from the armed forces as a result of unfair treatment, and this needs to also be brought to the table. And of course, these are also immediate agenda that the new service chiefs should also take forward. The government should put in place a transparent monitoring framework for security votes. The government should also ensure that these funds are channeled to security and defense agencies. What we have noticed in this country is a paradox of plenty. The more money we put into security, the more insecurity we begin to get. And that begins to interrogate the need for us to ask what exactly are this money being used for. Annually, the money that goes into security votes amounts to about 242 billion on an annual basis. And that is a whole lot of money. How do we begin to transfer this kind of spending into conventional security institutions and not deprive them of funding? This money represents about 70% of the money that goes to the Nigerian police. It's actually bigger than the Nigerian Air Force and Nigerian Navy budget put together. And that for us is not a very constructive approach to secure and manage people in this country. The federal government should urgently constitute the National Council on Procurement to actively coordinate the activities of Bureau of Public Procurement and give full effect to the Public Procurement Act 2007. And this for me was a campaign promise by the president. And 6 years after, he still hasn't done anything. This is an aspersion on this person and his integrity. He needs to act on this urgently. We call on the revenue generating agencies like the Federal Inland Revenue Service, the National Port Authority, and the Nigerian Customs Service to ensure that they improve efforts to curb extortion and bribery amongst their officials. There is also need to operationalize the anti-corruption strategy to ensure that anti-corruption efforts are not concentrated at the federal level alone. Also, other arms of government need to be involved in the fight against corruption. It shouldn't be left alone to the executive. This is something that must be cross-cutting at every level of government and at every tier of governance. And this is fundamental because there is a huge gap in terms of how anti-corruption response happens at federal level and how it happens at state level. Governors are emperors at various states, and they have indeed, created an empire that nobody can actually build into. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, you would agree with us that it will be of immense benefit to public institutions, the government, and Nigerian citizens if these recommendations are implemented. God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and God continue to bless our troops. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers for delivering the first statement. So now we'll take a round of questions from colleagues from the media and other stakeholders present. So please, if you have a question, can you just indicate by raising up your hand? Okay, one.
Thank you very much. My name is Abiola Shido, President of Nigeria. Kindly, I would like to know what efforts consulting of them put in place into investigating some of the money voted into the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and how they have expended some of these things concerning COVID-19 and how the new scheme, the one that involves the Empower and all of it, the school feeding and all of that. It seems the numbers released by the ministry do not tally with what we have with us. So kindly, what efforts have been put into making sure that we find out the truth from that area?
Thank you very much. I think the speakers will note that down. Any other question? I'm not missing any hand. Okay, so.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think the immediate response would be that the report that was released by ICPC, which I referenced a short while ago, might be a very useful compendium that we want to consult. And that was because that report suggested that so much money were taken as a result of the response fund and of course school feeding program. And they specifically mentioned school feeding program over the lockdown. And that is because, and that was because so much that was actually expended was actually not found to have been distributed, and the impact of it was not felt on the ground. And that generated quite a lot of concern. And of course, ICPC is also a government agency, and it is not an independent source in itself. So some people were indicted, and that report is actually public. But the tragedy of our national discourse is that once those kind of reports are being put in public domain, it is expected that those who have the powers of prosecution should actually take it forward and investigate, then prosecute afterwards. But unfortunately, we don't see that happening. And that is actually where we have some level of lag. And of course, if you recall, we had also mentioned in the statement that there is a huge need for government to actually, as a matter of urgency, begin to put its searchlight on those fundings and monies that have been taken away by citizens as a result or in the name of implementing the response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, so just a rider to what my colleague said. The report is out there in the public space, CSOs and media, we all about what we do. How are we pushing for that report to get for the president to be able to act on that, or relevant agencies that are implementing act on such reports. CSOs, advocacies, media, push out those information every day. Let's talk about it so that we can get justice for who really deserve it. These are public money. These are taxpayers' money. So it simply means that something has happened, which is corruption, has been brought out. What are we doing, CSOs as media, to ensure that that money is
Just to add a bit to it is that this strictly civil space undermines citizens' engagement with those kind of process. So part of all of our core is that there is need to open up the civic space for citizens to actually interrogate in depth-wise this kind of report. So when you engage with this kind of report, the next thing, like the executive director of CISLAC has said, you are giving names on patriotic citizens. But whereas these are the real patriotic citizens, we must free up the civic space and not string it, unlike what we have already seen in this country.
Thank you very much for that. Is there any other question? Okay, otherwise, would like to thank all of you. Any question or observation or comments?
Good morning, everyone. So just to add to what Tolu from Budget said, I think that as citizens, the onus is on us to demand for accountability. While there is shrinking civic space and government has a part to play in that, we that have the information, the onus is on us to share the information to everyone. Everyone saw how the NSAS protests were in traction again because of how many people were involved in it. So the more we keep sending out information to people, the better it is, the better the fight against corruption is. So I think engagement is one, but secondly, informed engagement is very important.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right. In the absence of any comments or question, would like to thank you all for joining us in this press conference on behalf of the Executive Director, the Board of Management of CISLAC, our partners from Budget, CDD, and other important CSO partners we have. We'd like to thank you all, and we appreciate you for joining us in this launch of CPI 2020. We'll be available for press interviews and other appearances in your medium. So we appreciate if you get this invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.